John read?
Yeah, I'll just do it.
Okay.
Thanks. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Sovereign Grace Chapel this morning, to our morning worship service. And we continue in the book of 2 Samuel, as you're well aware by now, I'm sure. And this morning, we're coming to the very end of chapter 17, but then the bulk will be in chapter 18, and God willing, we might even get into chapter 19 this morning, so we'll see how it goes. So we continue to read about the shock, what I would call the shock waves that set up on the aftermath of David's sin with Bathsheba. And I guess one of the things that's really been impressive to me about this study is the ramifications of that sin are almost more startlingly difficult than the sin itself. And so the rest of the book after chapter 9, which was the chapter in which described David's sin, we've been dealing with all of the difficulties that ensued after that. So you can really look at the book of 2 Samuel in two parts. You have the ascendance of David up to that point, and then the descending aspects of David after the sin. And so to this morning sermon and these particular chapters we're looking at are still, think of them as still the reverberations that are still present on the heels of this great sin that he committed. And so that's the thing that is so impressive about it, impressive in a negative sense, I should say, that David's sin has such horrendous ramifications. So it's hard for me to comprehend this matter of David and Bathsheba, but not only that, his willingness to go so far as to murder a man to cover it up. Let's not forget about that part. And it's quite a troubling thing. And, you know, I guess in some sense we have to look at David and his life and say, well, how is it that that could happen to a believer? And we were talking this morning about Romans 1, how the unbelieving world suppresses the truth in unrighteousness. But I have to understand David in the light of his own suppression of the truth. Did he not know that Jehovah, the God of Israel, does not have an all-seeing eye? That he's not omnipresent with our every thought, word, and deed? Did David not have that understanding? And I think that David did have that understanding, but he suppressed that for a time, for a moment, for a brief episode of his life, and thought perhaps he could get away with this matter because it wasn't him who came to this conclusion on his own that he wasn't going to get away with it. He had to have the prophet Nathan come to him and confront him with it. And at that moment, the Spirit of God pierced his heart, and he realized that he was, oh no, not going to get away with this. And perhaps what grows from that exposure is the understanding that God is a righteous God. You know, the other thing that's so impressive in a negative sense about this is that David's sin occurred on the immediate heels of the Davidic covenant being delivered to him. So in one instance, you have God disclosing to David that he would be a dynasty, and there would be kings coming forth from him, ultimately resulting in a king who would implement a righteous rule that would be an eternal kingdom. And so this is a glorious disclosure to David and to his line and to his progeny. And then the next chapter, he's sinning with Bathsheba. So did he think because of this great exalted position that he had been granted by God to be the receiver of this Davidic covenant, that somehow sin was going to be permissible in his life? Well, sin was not going to be permissible in his life. because he came to realize that when the prophet came to him and confronted him, God could not look the other way. And so now we know that God is a righteous God, even as it relates to his own elect people. And David is going to have to suffer the temporal consequences. And he did find forgiveness. And I guess if that's any shining light in this matter, that there seems to be no sin that a believer cannot fall into that would escape God's forgiveness. Because if David is forgiven for what he did, surely we all can find forgiveness for our lesser sins. So God is a righteous God, and he is going to have to act righteously even to an anointed king who dared to commit such unrighteous acts, and he will be called into account for it. That's what we're reading about, all these chapters subsequent to it. You know, and I think about this whole matter of the ramifications of unrighteous behavior, and we see such unrighteousness in our own world today. And I think what's missing, so blatantly missing in our world, is a fear of God. And we're living in a nation of supposed atheists. And I know that there is no true atheist in the sense that everybody has been implanted in their conscience the knowledge that there is a God to whom we should be accountable. But that suppression of that truth has been so profoundly developed and so powerful of a suppression that it is, that they act as though they're atheists. And they claim themselves to be atheists. And when you don't have any fear of God in a society, well, you can see how it goes, what happens. Well, unbeknownst to David, Absalom has embraced the bad advice of Hushai. We're coming to that point in this narrative where David has escaped from the city of Jerusalem because his son Absalom is taking over and would have killed him if he had found him in Jerusalem. So David urgently fled the city. And then he received word that he needed to urgently cross over the Jordan because he had spies within the camp of Absalom back in Jerusalem. And the thing, though, that I'm saying here is that David did not know that he had an answer to a prayer that he had prayed earlier, because there was this advisor by the name of Ahithophel who was highly respected, and David said, "Oh no, Ahithophel is with Absalom." And David prayed, "May Ahithophel's advice be brought to folly." That was David's prayer. Well, he didn't know that prayer had been answered in the person of Hushai, who went to Absalom and delivered to him competing advice that was really designed to thwart Absalom's efforts. And Absalom embraced the bad advice and rejected the good advice that would have been the one that would have given him success. And so David's not aware that this has happened. Now Absalom is going to be producing a course of action designed to capture David and to suppress those who are loyal to David. He's now going to pursue a course of action that's going to defeat himself, that's going to result in his rebellion being suppressed and also going to cost him his life. And that's all because God answered David's prayer about this advice business. So God is the one who's going to bring the rebellion to a close. Well, rebellion for an unbeliever results in eternal damnation, but for the believer, a rebellion results in the temporal chastisement with an eye towards restoration. So, I suppose we should be encouraged that even David, who had been given the great privileges and even the wisdom from God, and who fell into such an egregious sin, still found forgiveness. That's really an amazing thing about the Lord, the depth of his forgiveness. And he will find a path back to God, although that path is filled with many sorrows, as we are seeing as the story unfolds. The text that we have before us today, we were going to see the preparations for the Civil War. We're going to see the war itself, and we're going to see the results of the war in the restoration of David to the throne. We pick up at verse 24 of chapter, I'm forgetting chapter numbers for a second, 17, sorry about that. So open your Bibles, if you would, to 17:24. And read with me the verses 24 through 29. Then David came to Mahanaim, and Absalom crossed the Jordan, he and all the men of Israel with him. Absalom sent Amasa over the army in place of Joab. Now Amasa was the son of a man whose name was Ithra, the Israelite, who went in to Abigail, the daughter of Nahash, sister of Zeruiah, Joab's mother. And Israel and Absalom camped in the land of Gilead. Now when David had come to Mahanaim, Shobi, the son of Nahash from Rabbah, of the sons of Ammon, Makir, the son of Amiel, from Lo Debar, and Barzillai, the Gilead, from Rogelim, brought beds, basins, pottery, wheat, barley, flour, parched grain, beans, lentils, parched seeds, honey, curds, sheep, and cheese of the herd, for David and for the people who were with him to eat. For they said, the people are hungry and weary and thirsty in the wilderness. So here, beginning in verse 24, we jump forward in time from that day when David crossed over the Jordan. And now we see that Absalom has delayed his pursuit for a period of time to amass a bigger army from all of the tribes of Israel to come against David. And we see that after having waited and done that, Absalom is crossing over the Jordan in pursuit of David. And then in 25, our author makes mention of a man by the name of Amasa. And so what we find out here is that Joab has remained loyal to David, and so Absalom needed to replace Joab as the general of the army, and so he appointed Amasa to that particular role. So Amasa is in rebellion and in cahoots with Absalom. And so his father, Amasa's father, is described as an Israelite. Well, that's a unique way of describing somebody in the scriptures. Usually say so-and-so is a member, is a Benjaminite or from the tribe of Judah or what have you. But here he's described as an Israelite. But then, furthermore, in Chronicles calls his father an Ishmaelite. So there's been some dispute about, well, how's that reconciled? And so the reconciliation is that this man seems to have been a proselyte to Israel, and that he has embraced the God of Israel, and so he's an Israelite in that sense, although naturally speaking he was an Ishmaelite. But the interesting thing about Amasa, and all the reason for all of this genealogy that's rather convoluted and hard to follow, the bottom line with Amasa is that he's a blood relative of David. And he's also a blood relative to Joab. So Amasa emerging as a player in this whole narrative is further confirmation that the whole rebellion thing is revolving around David's own household, because he's a blood relative of David. And so everything revolves around that bloodline as this nation goes into civil war. Verses 27 through 29, we see here that there's growing support across the Jordan for David's position. So we see about people from Ammon, Lo-debar, and Gilead. They're sending greetings and supplies to David and his men. And these are all Transjordan peoples. And David is Transjordan. He's east of the Jordan River right now. Isn't it interesting how prominent the Jordan River consistently plays a role in Israel's history? And it certainly plays a role in this particular episode as well. Well, I suppose David would be heartened by the support and encouraged that the Lord would be with him in the battle to come. And so, when we read that all Israel had gone over to Absalom earlier, I think that's really a relative statement, because perhaps you can say a majority of Israelites had gone over with Absalom to support the rebellion. But in fact, there's many, many people involved in this whole matter who are supportive of David as well. And it seems as though David is able to regather his forces to the degree to have enough firepower to resist the rebellion. And that's what's happened. And this is the bad advice that Absalom took, allowing David the time to put together a force to oppose him. And that's what's happening here. But I think ultimately we need to understand that the Lord is clearly orchestrating these events to assure the victory for David. That brings us to chapter 18, verses 1 through 5, if you'll follow along with me. Then David numbered the people who were with him and set over them commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds. David sent the people out, 1/3 under the command of Joab, 1/3 under the command of Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, Joab's brother, and 1/3 under the command of Ittai, the Gittite. And the king said to the people, I myself surely go out with you also. But the people said, you shall not go out, for if we indeed flee, they will not care about us. Even if half of us die, they will not care about us. But you are worth 10,000 of us. Therefore now it is better that you be ready to help us from the city. Then the king said to them, whatever seems best to you I will do. So the king stood beside the gate, and all the people went out by the hundreds and the thousands. The king charged Joab and Abishai and Ittai, saying, deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom. And all the people heard when the king charged all the commanders concerning Absalom. So here we see, beginning in verse 1, David's preparation has prepared for the war. And he starts by appointing 3 men to command 3 divisions of the army. But in addition to the 3 commanders, he's also appointing other men to be commanders over a lower rank, appropriate to command hundreds of the soldiers. So David knows how to structure an army, let's put it that way. He's putting the command structure in place. And this is going to serve him well. So first we read about Joab, who will command 1/3 of the army. And we know much about Joab. He's been with David for many, many years. He's a tough, capable fighter. And I would say Joab alone would be difficult to defeat. This is a seasoned, hardened soldier. And then secondly, David appoints Abishai, who's Joab's brother, to be a commander over 1/3. And I don't think Abishai is any inferior to Joab as far as experience and toughness and leadership quality to lead a third of the forces. You know, these two brothers, at one point David complained about them, saying, these two guys are too much for me. And they're vigorous and in some sense uncontrollable men, even though under the command of David. But they are their own men. I don't know if you remember the episode with the commander under Ishbosheth, who was the son of Saul when he was being raised up by Abner to be an opposition earlier to David. And it was Joab who murdered Abner because of that. And that was something that was not permissible by David. David didn't do anything about it, but he was upset about it. That's the same Joab. We know a lot about Joab. And we're going to learn more about him this morning. This is going to be very interesting. Joab's a major player in all of this. We should know a lot about him. And then finally, he appoints a Gittite, a Philistine, to be commander over a third of David's army. You know, it's just amazing. You think there's the Israelites and then there's all the pagans that we hate. But it's not quite like that, because this man devoted himself to David's service, and David had great confidence in him, although he be a Philistine. So those are the three men that are going to lead against the rebellion. In verse 2, it comes to this crucial moment. David, perhaps not wanting to repeat the folly of staying home while his men were out with Joab to fight the Ammonites. Remember, that was the problem with Bathsheba and the whole episode there, where David was lounging around the castle while Joab was out fighting the Ammonites. And that whole episode led to him being involved in this lustful situation that caused all of the troubles. Well, now David's saying, no, I'm coming with you this time. Well, no, you're not coming with us this time, David. This is not wise, because your life is worth 10,000 of us, because the whole point of this rebellion is between two men, the son of one or the other. So if you get killed out there by a stray arrow, the rebellion will succeed. The war's over. It really boils down to which man is going to survive. And whoever is the survivor of the two will be the king in Israel. So these men wisely tell David, no, you've got to stay back here in the city. We can't afford to lose you. You are the whole reason for the battle in the first place. And so David acquiesced to that and said, whatever seems right in your eyes, I will do. Contrast that with what is Absalom's bad advice, telling him, yeah, you get in front of the charge. You're going to have great glory out of this. So that's something to tuck in the back of your mind at the moment. So verse 5, David gives the men one last order before they are leaving to fight. Go easy on Absalom. So here, David is revealing his weakness, for he's basically maybe putting his men into a dangerous situation because they're now not supposed to kill Absalom. What if they come across him in a firefight? What are they supposed to do? Not kill Absalom? Not confront him, but just his men? How's that going to work? So David's asking of his men something that's very untenable. But because he's his son, he wants Absalom to survive the battle. And he makes that point abundantly clear, because everybody who are passing by David on the way out the city gate to go to war heard it. Don't lay a hand on Absalom. I want him preserved. Well, I don't know how this is going to look to the nation. Thousands are going to die to preserve David, but the man who conspired to overthrow him is supposed to be left alive. How is that going to resolve itself? Read with me verses 6, 7, and 8. Then the people went out into the field against Israel, and the battle took place in the forest of Ephraim. The people of Israel were defeated there before the servants of David, and the slaughter there that day was great, 20,000 men. For the battle there was spread over the whole countryside, and the forest devoured more people that day than the sword devoured. And here in these brief 3 verses, we have a summary, a quick summary, I would say, of the battle that took place that day. And the significant thing here is it took place in this forest in Ephraim. And so I think this is a significant point. We're not told how or why this particular engagement occurred in this forest. We just know that it did. But the forest, as it turns out to be the worst possible place for Absalom and his men to be. Because what does this statement mean? That the forest devoured more men than the sword. How are we supposed to understand that? And also, we're told that 20,000 men lose their lives that day, although we don't know the proportion of David's men versus Absalom's men. But here, 20,000, just stop and think about this. 20,000 men are going to lose their life this day. And it all goes back to David's sin with Bathsheba. And all the ramifications from that. What a tremendous loss of life. All related to the actions between 2 men, a father and a son. It's the political power struggles of kingdoms is just rife with this kind of result. How many soldiers, how many men, how many millions and millions of soldiers have died over the centuries because of the political power struggle in some castle somewhere? And all the forces are deployed to protect one party or the other. It seems like Israel is not exempt from that kind of thing, at least at this juncture. But I think we must not lose sight of the fact that the Lord is forcing this issue to determine who's going to occupy the throne of the king of Israel. David cannot, I contend, cannot be overthrown. You know, else people will lose sight of the whole Davidic covenant and the dynasty that was prophesied and promised to David. And yes, I know Absalom is his son, but is this going to be a kingdom that's going to be ruled by violent overthrow of the father? Is that what God had in mind with the Davidic dynasty? And if David loses his life, I think the whole enterprise is at risk. This is a crucial moment in Israelite history. Whether this thriving, fledgling little country of Israelites is going to survive as an entity. From a human standpoint, you would think that this nation is not viable. There's civil war. And frankly, this little civil war here is really only preparatory to the bigger civil war that's about to come later, after Solomon passes off the scene. And there's a big split between the north and the south. How fraught with trouble and difficulty this nation has been when you think about all of the troubles of this nation. And how are these people still a people even today? We were talking about that the other day, about how the people who are of Israelite bloodline, descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they still, people of our generation, still identify as Jewish. Why? They don't believe in the Bible. They don't believe in God. They're atheists too. They're as crazy secular as everybody else, or they're mystical, but they're Jews. And I'm convinced that God will not let that bloodline identity die. Because if you think about all of the troubles that you see in this nation, how in the world did they become a nation? How did they survived? How did this little nation stay together to deliver the Messiah at the time of Jesus? You only have to see this in the light of God's providential care and perseverance with this people to bring them to that point, to bring forth the Messiah ultimately. And where God's not done with them yet, let's not enter into that nonsense. God is not done with these people yet, for many promises have yet to be fulfilled to them. But here the forest devoured as many men as the sword. Well, I think the point that we can take away from that statement is that God is defeating the rebels as much as David's men are defeating the rebels. We can add this to a long, a long list of strange and creative ways in which God accomplishes his military victories. We can add it to the idea of walls collapsing, a hailstorm, confusion in the camps, surprise ambushes. God has a way of dealing with his enemies in a host of different ways. So there's no set formula for God to use in terms of defeating the enemies of his people. So we add this forest to the list. And so I think this is all done so that God doesn't leave us with the impression that there's a right way and a wrong way to fight the enemy, for God can deliver in a host of different ways. Look at verses 9 through 15 with me as I read forward here. Now Absalom happened to meet the servants of David, for Absalom was riding on his mule, and the mule went under the thick branches of a great oak, and his head caught fast in the oak, so he was left hanging between heaven and earth, while the mule that was under him kept going. When a certain man saw it, he told Joab and said, "Behold, I saw Absalom hanging in an oak." Then Joab said to the man who had told him, "Now behold, you saw him? Why then did you not strike him there to the ground? And I would have given you 10 pieces of silver and a belt." The man said to Joab, "Even if I should receive 1,000 pieces of silver in my hand, I would not put out of my hand against the king's son. For in our hearing, the king charged you and Abishai and Ittai, saying, protect for me the young man Absalom. Otherwise, if I had dealt treacherously against his life, and there is nothing hidden from the king, then you yourself would have stood aloof." Then Joab said, "I will not waste my time here with you." So he took 3 spears in his hand and thrust them through the heart of Absalom while he was yet alive in the midst of the oak. And the 10 young men who carried Joab's armor gathered around and struck Absalom and killed him. Well, if you remember, we learned about Absalom's incredibly thick head of hair. Remember, he had to cut it off every year, put it on a scale, it weighed 5 pounds. He was growing 5 pounds of hair a year. And I'm not sure what that head of hair must look like. Maybe it was like a big afro or something, I don't know. 5 pounds of hair. Well, this is going to be Absalom's undoing ultimately here. And so, in this most bizarre scene, Absalom is seen riding his royal mule, and he's in the midst of this dense forest of Ephraim. And he seems to be by himself, but not far from the forces of the enemy, Joab and his men. And he's trying, I perceive he's ducking down, trying to get under a low-hanging branch, and all of a sudden his hair gets caught up in it, the mule keeps going, and he's trapped. He's hanging there from his hair. And can't get up, can't get down. And so, lo and behold, one of Joab's men comes along and sees him hanging there. And he goes back and tells, hey, Joab, I just saw Absalom hanging from a tree from his hair. And Joab says, why didn't you kill him? He said, well, you heard what I heard. Remember what David said as we were walking out the gates of the city? That we were not to bring a sword against his son? And he says, I don't care how much money you would give me. And by the way, Joab, I don't trust you. I could be the man who killed him, and then when it gets back to David that his son is dead, I'm not sure you wouldn't just throw me under the bus. And so Joab says, I'm not talking to you anymore. I'm not talking. So he just goes out. Oh, the Bible is just so interesting. So Joab spears him, but in addition, his men slay him with swords, I suppose, and they kill Absalom hanging from the tree. Well, this effectively brings an end to the rebellion. Like I said, if one of these two men die, what's the fight over after now? What's the point of fighting on? And Joab knew that because of verse 16. Read with me verses 16 through 18. Then Joab blew the trumpet, and the people returned from pursuing Israel, for Joab restrained the people. They took Absalom and cast him into a deep pit in the forest and erected over him a very great heap of stones. And all Israel fled, each to his tent. Now Absalom, in his lifetime, had taken and set up for himself a pillar, which is in the king's valley, for he said, I have no son to preserve my name. So he named the pillar after his own name, and it is called Absalom's monument to this day. So Joab knows that this battle needs to be brought to an end. He pulls back his forces. The reason for the battle is now evaporated. Absalom is dead. And so, as Absalom has died, so has the rebellion. And again, he took this foolish advice to become involved in the battle. And that foolish advice was given to him by the decree of God in answer to David's prayer. We can't lose sight of that. God is orchestrating all of this. And so, what did they do? They cast his body into a pit and covered it with rocks. This is somewhat reminiscent of the whole episode that took place with Joshua when they came across the Jordan River and they attacked Jericho, and the walls fell down in Jericho, and God said everything in that city is under the ban. You're not to take any booty, you're not to take any survivors, you're not to personally benefit from this battle. But there was a man by the name of Achan who didn't get the message, apparently didn't have the memo, and he stole some of the silver and put it under his coat and took it out of the city of Jericho. And then the next battle up was Ai, and they thought, well, if we can take Jericho so easily, Ai's a walk in the park. And David went out there with, I believe it was 3,500 men, and they got whooped and rejected and repelled by the city of Ai. And they all got all flustered by this because now they interpreted that rightly, that God was not with them anymore. So they're trying to figure out why God is not with them anymore. And through a process of elimination, they realized that it was Achan who had violated the ban of the booty. And so when he was found out, what did they do? They took Achan, his wife, his kids, his donkeys, his animals, everything associated with his name, and stoned them to death. And having stoned them to death, they piled a huge pile of rocks on top of them as a reminder about the dangers of disobeying the Lord. Well, it just reminded me of that whole scene by what they're doing here to Absalom. But Absalom had it in mind to do something else for himself because of this little side note in verse 18, how he had set up a monument to himself because he had no sons. Now, we previously read that Absalom did have sons. He had 3 sons. So we just surmise from this is that they must have died early or in childhood because he no longer has sons. And so I think that's indicative of the curse that Absalom is enduring. He's not going to have any follow-up progeny to inherit any of the land or promises in Israel. His line comes to an end. And the best he could do was erect a pillar to himself. And so you can speculate and maybe comment on what do you think about Absalom building a monument to himself. Reminds me, wasn't it Will Rogers? We have the Will Rogers shrine up there. And didn't he build that as a monument to himself? And some of his people came to him and said, you can't do that, Will. No, it wasn't Will Rogers. It was another one of our founders. And they renamed it because they said, that is just too self-serving. You can't name a monument after yourself. Well, Absalom did that here. So maybe that's just a little insight into his character, perhaps. Let's look at verses 19 through 23. Then Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said, please, let me run and bring the king news that the Lord has freed him from the hand of his enemies. But Joab said to him, you are not the man to carry news this day, but you shall carry news another day. However, you shall carry no news today because the king's son is dead. Then Joab said to the Cushite, you go, tell the king what you have seen. So the Cushite bowed to Joab and ran. Now Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said once more to Joab, but whatever happens, please let me run also after the Cushite. And Joab said, why would you run, my son, since you will have no reward for going? But whatever happens, he said, I will run. So he said to him, run. Then Ahimaaz ran by way of the plain and passed up the Cushite. So I don't know if you remember Ahimaaz. He was the young man who was sent from Jerusalem with a message to warn David to flee because he had information that Absalom was going to immediately deploy his forces to chase down David while he was weak and weary and before he became organized to slay him. Ahimaaz was sent to tell David these things, but along the way he got found out and he had to hide in a well. Remember that? And he hid in a well until Absalom's men came through and asked the owner of the well. The woman says, have you seen these boys? No, oh yeah, I did see them. They've already crossed over this brook over here. And so they left. They could not find him. And so she preserved Ahimaaz in that matter. And so he got out of the well and we went forward and warned David. And on that warning, David did that night cross over the Jordan and left himself in a safer position. So now we turn to him. He's this young man and obviously a great long distance runner, I might add. And he wants to be the first to tell David of the great victory. He wants to, he's just enthusiastic about it, I suppose. He's so wrapped up. Let me go tell David first. And Joab wisely said, no, this is not for you because the king's son is dead. And Joab knew this was going to be an issue. He knew this was going to be an issue. The young man did not understand that. So then Joab appoints this Cushite. You go tell David. So the Cushite takes off. And I suppose we're looking at something in the neighborhood of 20 or 30 miles back to Jerusalem. No, not back to Jerusalem, but back to the city where David is on the other side of the Jordan. Not back to Jerusalem, but back to where David is housed up while he's out of the country. So I perceive this to be maybe 20 or 30 miles. And so then Ahimaaz is not dissuaded by the first encounter on this matter. He goes back to Joab a second time. Please, let me go. I just want to be the one to tell David. So Joab says, all right, because the other Cushite is already on the road. He figures that messenger will get to David first, deliver the news, and suffer the ramifications of whatever David does with that news. And so he let this young man go second. But little did Joab know he was going to pass up the Cushite on the way, which we read about in verse 23. Read with me 24 through 30. Now David was sitting between the two gates, and the watchman went up to the roof of the gate by the wall and raised his eyes, and look, behold, a man running by himself. The watchman called and told the king. And the king said, if he is by himself, there is good news in his mouth. And he came nearer and nearer. Then the watchman saw another man running. And the watchman called to the gatekeeper and said, behold, another man running by himself. And the king said, this one also is bringing good news. The watchman said, I think the running of the first one is like the running of Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok. And the king said, this is a good man and comes with good news. So Ahimaaz called and said to the king, all is well. And he prostrated himself before the king with his face to the ground. And he said, blessed is the Lord your God, who has delivered up the men who lifted their hands against my lord the king. And the king said, it is well with the young man. Is it well with the young man Absalom? And Ahimaaz answered, when Joab sent the king's servant and your servant, I saw a great tumult, but I did not know what it was. Then the king said to him, turn aside and stand here. So he turned aside and stood still. So now the scene of the narrative turns back to Mahanaim, where David is anxiously awaiting the news of the outcome of the battle. And here comes this lone messenger. And David perceives this to be good news because he is alone. And why would David think that? I suppose he'd think that is that if there was a whole host of people running, they might be fleeing for their lives. But rather, this is just a messenger with news of the outcome. But regardless, David is perceiving good news, whatever, and is anticipating that nothing could be but good news. But then the watchman sees another man running by himself. Well, this is the Cushite who wasn't quite as speedy as Ahimaaz was in reaching David. And so I just want, on a side note, make mention that from this point forward, I think it's noteworthy that David is not being referred to by his name anymore by the narrator of the text we're reading. He's only going to refer to him as the king. The king, the king, the king, the king, the king. And I think he's doing this deliberately to reinforce in our minds that David is now the king, because Absalom is dead and the rebellion is going to fail. And so it's just an interesting side note. Well, the king believes he's about to receive good news. And at least the messengers think that he's going to deliver good news to David as well. So in verse 28, we see that Ahimaaz gets his wish. He's first to get to the king to announce what has happened, and he's enthusiastic with the announcement. Blessed is the Lord your God, he says, speaking to the king's relationship with the God of Israel. The good news, the men who rebelled have been delivered. In other words, they have been defeated. But the first thing out of the king's mouth is not, oh, thank goodness, oh, thank God. The first thing he wants to know about is Absalom. Well, that's all well and good, but let me know where we are with Absalom. And so when he asks about Absalom, well, Ahimaaz equivocates. He knows he doesn't want to be the deliverer of that bad news. So he says, well, there was this great commotion, and when the Cushite was leaving, and I just don't know. I don't know what happened. So he's just not willing to come forward with what might not be such good news. So somehow Ahimaaz is aware and cognizant of the fact that this might turn happiness into sorrow, and so he doesn't want to be the one to deliver that message. And this is exactly why Joab didn't want to send him first, because he knew Absalom's death is going to be on the topic when the king receives the news. So let's see what happens from here. Read with me 31 through 33. Behold, the Cushite arrived, and the Cushite said, let my lord the king receive good news, for the Lord has freed you this day from the hand of all those who rose up against you. Then the king said to the Cushite, is it well with the young man Absalom? And the Cushite answered, let the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up against you for evil be as that young man. The king was deeply moved and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And thus he said as he walked, O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son. So in verse 31, we see that the Cushite arrives, obviously slower than Ahimaaz. And the Cushite brings up again the good news. Good news, at least he thinks it's good news. But the king is not focused on this good news. He wants to know about Absalom. And in verse 32, he finally gets his answer. Absalom has ended up in the same place that most of the other rebels ended up, dead. And this really struck deep into the heart of David. So in verse 33, this good news is now turned into mourning and weeping. The king was deeply moved and wept. David cannot rejoice in the victory that his warriors and his supporters delivered to him. Not to mention the fact that the Lord was with his men, bringing about the circumstances for the victory. Did David not want to win this war? It's a legitimate question, because he's saying, oh, that I would have died instead of you. Well, are you saying, David, that it would have been better for you to die in the battle and that Absalom succeed in the rebellion? What are you thinking? What are you thinking? Or how do you think that your forces are going to dissolve the enemy and eradicate the rebellion, and then the one who perpetrated it, the head of it, the one who created the conspiracy in the first place, his life's going to be preserved? What, are you going to make him vice regent? How's that? I mean, what are you thinking, David? He has divided loyalties. I think on the one side he wanted to defend his kingship, but somehow, some way he wanted his son to survive in the rebellion. And I can say that such divided loyalties always turn out badly. Let's look at verses 1 through 7 to conclude this morning of chapter 19. Then it was told Joab, Behold, the king is weeping and mourns for Absalom. The victory that day was turned to mourning for all the people, for the people heard it, said that day, the king is grieved for his son. So the people went by stealth into the city that day, as people who are humiliated steal away when they flee in battle. The king covered his face and cried out with a loud voice, "Oh, my son Absalom! Oh, Absalom, my son, my son!" Then Joab came into the house of the king and said, "Today you have covered with shame the faces of all your servants, who today have saved your life and the lives of your sons and daughters and the lives of your wives and the lives of your concubines, by loving those who hate you and by hating those who love you. For you have shown today that princes and servants are nothing to you. For I know this day that if Absalom were alive and all of us were dead today, then you would have been pleased. Now therefore arise, go out and speak kindly to your servants. For I swear by the Lord, if you do not go out, surely not a man will pass the night with you. And this will be worse for you than all the evil that has come upon you from your youth until now." Well, we see now Joab is the man of the hour. And he has been informed of the king's reaction to the good news. And not only does he learn about David's reaction, but all the people hear their king is in mourning. This is a publicly known issue. He's crying out loudly. David is publicly before the people, and they see him mourning. And now, what they were anticipating was going to be a great victory lap, a great moment of rejoicing, a great celebration for the downfall of this rebellion. Now the people are confused and unsure how to react, so they're creeping back into the city like, did we do a bad thing? Should we be mourning with the king? I guess we should mourn. Was Absalom more important than the issue of the rebellion itself? Not able to celebrate. The whole nation is now befuddled. The man who launched the conspiracy, who led the rebellion, is dead and gone. But we are not supposed to mourn. But we are supposed to mourn. Verse 4, "Oh, my son Absalom, oh, Absalom, my son, oh, my son Absalom." Well, in verses 5 through 7, I think Joab has had it up to here with this nonsense. And so he steps forward. He's probably the one man who had the guts as well as this respect to go confront David on all of this. And he says to David, "You have shamed those who saved your life. You shamed those who saved your life. And you also shamed those who saved the lives of your wives and your concubines. You have shamed those who saved the lives of your sons." You're bringing shame upon the whole enterprise. So David, do you love those who hate you? Is that where we're at? And do you hate those who love you? I think those are good questions to be asked at this juncture. And I think these are questions that David needs to answer. First, why is David so upset over Absalom's death? Yes, I know he's his son, but I think the scriptures are giving us the impression that this is a little beyond a normal mourning of the loss of a son. It seems like this is intensified beyond measure and beyond reasonable reaction. At least that's my take on it. I think it's a little over the top. Why is David so violently and deeply wounded by this? Well, I think it all is rooted in what David knows about himself. I believe that he sees the ultimate end of his son's life is rooted in his own sin. It was he, David, who set all the dominoes in motion. and Absalom is now the latest casualty. And I think there's a part of the mourning and the depth of the grief has to do with David's own guilt in the matter. You might dispute that. That's my take on it. But Joab's words are stingingly harsh, but I think they're absolutely necessary. David needs to pull himself together at this point, because now that he's king, he's in danger of losing the kingdom anyway, because he's up there mourning, and now all the people are they going to remain loyal to him when they went out and fought and all he can talk about is Absalom, the rebellious son? Joab says, you better go out there and you better get your act together, and you better make it known that you are appreciative of these people that went to war for you. Else you're going to lose. Else, how did he put it? There's going to be worse will come upon you from your youth until now if you don't do this. So David must pull himself together. So it's just really, really difficult to comprehend all of the things that go on in David's mind. And I've said it more than once through these last few sermons, how David's lack of discernment, lack of perspective, he's lacking a clarity of right and wrong, good and evil. He doesn't have God's wisdom on these things. And I think this is just another example of David's failure to react appropriately, to understand that his son needed to die. You can't have both men survive this thing. And God decreed that it wouldn't happen. Absalom had to die. Now, the way in which Absalom died was kind of remarkable when you think about it, but he had to die. And David didn't seem to be prepared for that. Somehow, some way, David thought he could have his cake and eat it too. He thought he could retain the kingship, put down the rebellion, and still preserve his son's life. But God wasn't having it. Wasn't to be. Well, anyway, we'll conclude with that, and we'll continue this saga next Sunday. Bow with me in a word of prayer. Lord, we do thank you for the life of David and all the things that go on with him, and pray that there's some small measure of wisdom we can derive out of all of this that makes sense to us and would be beneficial to the way we conduct our lives. And so we do appreciate having embedded this narrative into Holy Scripture so that we might reflect upon these things in some detail and grow in grace in the knowledge that you were in the midst of this, and you're in the midst of all of the things of all of your people's lives, always directing and decreeing things to go in the direction that you would have. Thank you for the congregation this morning who came. I pray good blessings upon them this coming week. Grant opportunity for witness, and grant us the words to speak when those opportunities arise. I pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.